Hello and welcome to Jerry's Live! My name is Mott Tuman and we're going to be talking about how you can make your own watercolor paints today. I'm a big fan of watercolors. I love making my own, so I'm very excited for this show. But if you guys see any of the products that you see tonight, go to Jerry's. If you see any of the products that you see tonight and you'd like to get any of them, make sure you go to jerrysartorama.com and you type into the search bar our class code for tonight, which is JL294. JL294. I believe there will also be a link in the description for YouTube, maybe for Facebook as well. So, you see anything, you think it's cool, check it out there. And yeah, we can jump right in because there's going to be a lot of information in this show. If any of you saw Emmy's show from a couple of weeks ago, she did a show all about making your own oil paints. And I will say, watercolors is very complicated. I won't say it's more complicated than making oil paint, but there's a lot of different things you can add into it that can change your paint drastically. So we're gonna have a lot of stuff to cover. First things first though, before we even talk about what we're really gonna be using, we gotta talk about safety. So whenever you're doing any kind of like fine particulate matter, like especially pigments, not a lot of pigments, but there are many that are toxic. They're not good to inhale, and even the ones that aren't toxic are still not good for you to breathe in. So we're going to be wearing a mask if you're doing any kind of mulling or anything. Now I'm going to be wearing this KN95 mask. That should be good for you as well. You can also choose to wear a respirator, and that will work. But what I'm going to be doing for tonight, if you make your own paints at home, I highly recommend you keep this on the entirety of the time that you're making your paint. But what I'm going to be doing so that you guys are able to hear me very well is that once I have my pigment incorporated into my other materials, I'm going to be taking this off so you can hear me. I advise that you keep this on the whole time though. So that is what we're going to be doing. But we have right here our New York Central Muller plate. Anytime you're doing watercolors or oil paints as well, you're going to need some kind of glass mulling paint to break. You're actually not breaking the pigments down, to incorporate them into your binder. Now this plate, you can't really just use any piece of glass for it. It has a really fine surface, and it's kind of, you guys can kind of see it, it's almost like iced glass or frosted glass. That is the term. But the surface of it has been sanded, so there's just a little bit of texture, and it's really smooth, but when we're going to be grinding our pigments, and we got a few pigments here, they're essentially going to get rubbed into those little crevices, they're going to get pushed around and everything. And then our muller here, which is what we're going to be using, is a very heavy piece of sturdy glass, and it's what we're going to be using to essentially mull it into this surface. And this plate is also very heavy. This plate is great because it won't move around a lot, and this muller, this glass muller, there's going to be a lot of, I wouldn't say friction, because it's going to be moving around very smoothly, but you know, you're going to have a wet surface here, and it's going to stick to it, and there's a good chance that this will move around, even though this is a very thick plate. I think I can barely pick it up here, so I'm not going to try. But make sure whatever you're using to do this, you have a sturdy surface where your plate isn't going to be moving around a whole lot. So, pigments, which are probably the most exciting part about this. I have a few here. If you check out Emmy's show, any of the pigments that she used in her show, you can also use for watercolor. They're interchangeable. There really is no difference, but we got some of the Sennelier pigments here. So I got a chrome green light and then also primary blue, and we also got an iridescent one. And this is essentially, this isn't actually a pigment. Actually, there's a little bit of titanium oxide pigment in here, so there is a little bit of pigment in here, but it is mostly mica. Mica is not a pigment, but it is that what essentially gives it that shine, and it is a slightly larger particle than pigments typically are. So let me know in the chat, actually, do you guys want to see tonight me incorporate the mica into our paint? Because watercolors, it's a really intensive process for mulling, so I'll probably only be able to do one color tonight, so let me know. Do you want blue, green, and do you want them with the mica? Let me know right now. But before we get into that, I'll let you guys have some time to decide in the chat. I'm going to go over the different types of mediums that we're going to be incorporating into our paint. And there are a lot. First things first, which is the most important, is gum arabic. Gum arabic is your binder. This is the Winsor & Newton gum arabic. It has a bottle, but I kind of manhandled it and I broke the cap. So I have this little tiny one that I poured the rest of my gum arabic into. Gum arabic, what it is a sap from a tree in the Middle East, and it is probably the best binder that you can use for watercolor. It's the one that most people use. It's very clear. It has a slightly yellow color to it, but it's very clear and it is water soluble. It's what gives the pigment that property of being able to break down with water, but at the same time it's able to hold the pigment in. That's what's great about it. There are other, for any of you that want to know, there are other types of binders, tree saps that you can use. I did a little reading and I heard, I think it was the prunus species of tree has been known to have good saps, and that is like peach trees and things like that. I have not done any of that myself though, but in case you want to know, lots of tree saps will work, but gum arabic is probably your best bet. And it normally comes in like large chunks of sap if you were gonna buy raw gum arabic, and people will grind them up into fine powder, which is another way you can get it. This right here is a syrup, essentially. You can make your own syrup using gum arabic. This comes pre-prepared, and it makes this process a lot easier because there's a lot of different things that you can do that like add step to this, like finding your own pigments, grinding your own pigments, and it just kind of adds more and more steps that can make this even more complicated because with each step you have to be very precise. But I highly recommend Winsor & Newton's gum arabic. It's very good. Our other add-ins here are gonna be, for one, clove oil. Clove oil, this stuff is extremely potent, but it acts as a preservative. So it's antifungal and antibacterial. It'll keep your paints from molding. It smells very strong. There's a few other oils that also you can use for this. I believe rosemary oil is also a common one. The tiniest, you will need the tiniest little bit of it, and I'll show you in a little bit how small it actually is, but like even large batches, the tiniest little bit. This can drastically change the performance of your paints if you add too much. But our last thing that we're gonna be using as additives is what is known as a humectant. And there's a couple different that people use. We have vegetable glycerin, which is probably the more popular because it's a little bit easier to control. And then we also have honey. If you know paints, like a lot of paint brands, I think Michael Harding might use honey. I know Sennelier definitely uses honey. It's popular, and some, I know people who make their own paints will use like local honey that they have sourced. Filtered honey with no other additives in it is your best bet. And humectants, what they are, I know I threw out that fancy word there, but I didn't explain what it is. It is essentially what keeps your paint from drying out. It's gonna help you reactivate it. It's gonna keep it a little bit moist. And I can show you right here, if we go to the overhead, I made a lot of different pans of paint for you guys to kind of see. Now these two I made yesterday. You can see they're a lot wetter because these are the ones that have humectants in them. Now, I think for both of these, I added probably too much humectant, which means if you add too much humectant, they're more likely to be shiny and sticky, and there's a chance they might not pan properly, might not dry properly. But all of these ones here, I actually didn't add humectants here, and I can show you the difference. They all kind of are just really solid, hard, matte cakes of paint. And you can use these to paint, and I did. I have a couple different swatches here that I created, and this is our New York Central watercolor paper. A couple different swatches here. You can see like the paints turned out decently well. Oh, let me get them so you can actually see them here. And I had to try a lot of different ratios of all of our different additives to be able to figure out what a good ratio might be, and I still haven't figured it out. Like, I created all of these pans of paint are the same pigment, and I even did more than this that I didn't end up panning because I could already tell that they weren't gonna be even very good to show you guys. And it takes a really long process of figuring it out because every single pigment that you use is gonna act differently. This chrome green light is gonna work differently than your primary blue, and you're gonna have to add different amounts of things to figure it out. So in tonight's show, I am not an expert paint maker. I'm gonna give you the best I can from all the research I've done, a good overlook of everything, but I want you to know that I'm not gonna be giving you an exact recipe. I'll give you general amounts, like, oh, you tend to use like this much gum arabic, or you tend to use more gum arabic than clove oil or something like that. But a lot of this has to do with experimentation. It varies drastically between different pigments. And a lot of times paint makers like to hold their recipes very close to their heart because that's how they make money. So I'm sorry that I don't have like the perfect recipe for you. I did try to figure one out. I didn't quite get there though. But did we have any idea of what kind of pigment we wanted to be mixing? Yeah?
It looks like we are overwhelmingly in favor of the mica.
Okay.
And that the blue has eked ahead.
Okay, blue. I've done a lot of green. We're gonna try some blue. Okay, so let me see. I'm going to start out by putting down our wet ingredients so I don't quite have to put my mask on yet. I will tell you guys, the iridescent powder, the tricky thing about it is that since the particles of mica are larger than typical pigments, it absorbs like a lot of water. Like mica is what we say it's very thirsty. It likes to drink up a ton of water. And it is more difficult to create than a regular pigment. I would recommend if you start out paint making, you don't start out your first batch with mica. It's a lot of fun though. If you just want to mess around and you don't care what the quality is necessarily going to be, definitely try it. But your mica powder can, like, it can make your pans crack a lot more. You're going to have to create, if you're layering your paints in several layers like you would for a typical pan of watercolor, you're going to want to do a lot of different layers. If you're using mica, just because it'll lead your watercolors to crack more because of the larger particle size. But I'm going to start here by putting down my gum arabic. And I am going to be using 1 teaspoon of gum arabic. I have these handy little measuring tools here. So let me just pour out a little bit of that. And if we have any questions, now would be a great time. But let me just pour this in here. As you can see, I'm running low on my gum arabic because I used so much of it creating these paints. You will go through it very fast if you start doing a lot of paint making. And hopefully you guys could hear me over me tapping on the glass there. There's gonna be kind of an interesting sound that's gonna happen when I start mulling. But yes, do we have a question?
We have a few questions on YouTube. Do you usually make your own watercolor paints?
I don't typically. I only luckily got access to the materials recently because of my wonderful job here at Jerry's Artorama. But I have watched a lot of videos on it because I have always wanted to do it and done a ton of research even before I came to this job. So I don't typically, I would love to do more of it. It's a process that, like, prior to the Industrial Revolution, it was a lot more typical for artists to create their own paints. And I'm gonna interrupt myself real quick because I'm gonna show you guys how much clove oil I'm gonna add here. This is our clove oil, and you really need the tiniest amount, and I mean not even a full drop of this. So I am actually gonna take my little palette knife here. I almost called it a spatula. And I am gonna very carefully drip a really small amount of this on, and that's it. You guys can see how small that is. That might even be too much. You need the tiniest bit, because this, even that tiny amount after I cap this, we're gonna all be able to smell it. That's how potent this is. If you have smell sensitivities, be warned. You should be wearing a mask anyway, but. So we're gonna put that tiny clove oil in. It smells good, yeah. And then, oh, as I was saying, prior to the Industrial Revolution, a lot of artists would make their own paints. And I think everyone, if you can't get access to paint making materials, then I think everyone should at least, like, do research into paint making, because even if you're never going to do it, it's very helpful for understanding your paints, understanding the makeup of different brands of paints, and why things perform the way they do. Like, if you have paints that crack a lot, you're like, what additive is not in here that's causing these to crack a lot? Or if you want your paints to flow a lot more than they typically would, what can I add in to make that happen? Making your own paints and doing research into paint making can help you understand that a lot better. And we all like to say here at Jerry's, the better you understand your art, the better art you will be able to create, just because you will be able to manipulate your materials to the best quality that you can. So I'm adding in 1/8 of a teaspoon of honey here. Like you guys saw in my little pans, the tiniest bit of your humectant, whether it's glycerin or honey, is gonna be potent. You need more than clove oil. Clove oil, you need the tiniest bit. But like, if you add any more of the humectant, you might run into the problem where your paints will never fully set. They'll never fully dry. I know Emmy has had this problem before. And I even have, while we're talking about, well, let me get into grinding. So grinding's gonna take a while, so I will have lots of time to talk, but I'll actually be able to show you guys something cool when I'm doing it. So I got my honey, clove oil, I got my binder, so now we can add in pigment. So I'm gonna put my KN95 mask on. You guys can see it here. Woo! I'll try to speak louder. Can you guys hear me okay? Cool. Okay, great. I'm gonna scoop out, I have a little bit of honey still in here. Actually, yeah, I'll scoop out a little bit more honey here. This might be too much honey because that is a decent amount, but I'm also adding mica pigment into this. And so we're gonna be a little pigment heavy. I'm gonna get a rag here and wipe off.
Speaking of pigments, how do you decide what colors you want to use for your homemade paints?
So, I mean, you can use any colors you like, whatever your heart desires, but a good recommendation for beginners is to try to start out, if you can, try to figure out, one, if the pigment is toxic or not, because like your cadmiums and pigments like that, they're easy to work with in terms of making your own paint, but they are highly toxic and dangerous to work with. You know, do not be making paints in the same room as you are with your children or your pets. A lot of them can be very sensitive to this, or if your kids are there, make sure they're wearing masks and not getting into your stuff. I'm gonna add a really small amount of this, probably a 1/16 of a teaspoon, because this shine, it's a powerful shine. So I'm gonna add a tiny bit amount of that. And, gosh, sorry, what was I saying? What was the question again? Can you remind me real fast? Because I had something else to say.
Well, it was how do you decide on colors?
Oh, I would recommend that you try to look into earth pigments or like iron oxides. Iron oxides and earth pigments are blue. I'm sorry, guys. I am really out of it today. Blue. Iron oxides and earth pigments tend to be easier to use and easier to work with than your more synthetic pigments. So that is what I would recommend if you're starting out as a beginner. Yes, we have more questions.
Oh yes. Can you tell us exactly what mica is?
Mica is a mineral. It comes from the earth like any other, like lots of pigments do. It's not a pigment because it doesn't actually have a color itself. But you can find mica in like stones in the earth. I couldn't tell you exactly like geologically how it is formed. Unfortunately, I don't know a lot of geology, but that's essentially what it is. It's just small shiny bits of minerals that you're adding into your pigments. And mica is what is used for essentially all shiny metallic pigments that you get. Most of them have mica in it. Some people might get it confused with glitter, but glitter is too like heavy for watercolors. They're really large pigment. I mean, they're not pigments. They're really large in size, and the larger pigments get with watercolors, the more complicated things get, because it gets into gouache territory. Something else about iron oxides that I mentioned, it's really good for beginners, but as a warning, iron oxides tend to be less transparent than other pigments. But pigments that tend to be more transparent tend to be difficult to work with, more difficult to work with. So if you have a pigment that you know is extremely transparent, it's going to be harder for you to work with when you're a beginner, just because getting that transparency right, and since the pigment size is so small, getting it mold perfectly into your binder is going to be difficult, and it's going to take a very long time. Yes?
Does the temperature or humidity of the day make a difference when you're mixing them and when you're panning them at the end?
So when you're mixing, not as much. Humidity can affect it. So you'll notice when I'm working here, whenever we're doing, I'm taking 1/8 of a teaspoon of pigment here. Whenever you're working with paints, we're going to be mulling this for a long time. I would recommend, like, it's going to change drastically depending on what pigment you're working with. But generally, you will mull your paints for between 20 minutes to maybe up to 2 hours, which is a very, very long time. We will not be mulling for that long. You can mull shorter than that and still get an effective paint. But when you get into really difficult pigments and you want really high quality paints, you're going to be mulling for a very long time, and it takes some arm strength. So be aware of that. But humidity, if you're mulling for a very long time, you guys can see, you know, this is going to be really thinned out, right? I recommend too, you start with a smaller batch because you're going to have to mull it for a shorter amount of time than if you made a really large batch of paint. But this is going to get thinned out, and over time, this can dry a little bit. And the tip I have for you for that, if your paints start getting a little bit dry and a little bit too tacky on this, one, you might have too much pigment because it should stay fairly wet for a while. Like, I could leave this out for half an hour and I could come back and it would still be fine to mull. I don't recommend you do that. Try to like get it done if you get it down on the plate. but it should be fine. But if it starts getting really dry and you think you have enough binder in it, something you can do is you can get distilled water. And as I mentioned earlier, gum arabic can come in a powder form, and people will make their syrups that they're using with distilled water, because distilled water will not cause mold or bacteria to form in your paints. That is important. You can't just use water straight out of the tap, otherwise your paints are prone to mold. And even your clove oil, which is antibacterial and antifungal, does not stand a fighting chance if you basically imbue your paints with the potential for bacteria and fungi. So make sure you use distilled water, but you can spritz your paints that you're mulling with a little bit of distilled water if they start getting too tacky. Yes.
How precise do you have to be with your ratios?
So fairly precise. But like I said, I am unable to give you an exact recipe because I am not a master paint maker, unfortunately. I wish I was, that'd be amazing. But the percentage of gum arabic to pigment is gonna change drastically. I recommend whenever you're starting out mixing your own paints that you start out with a 1-to-1 ratio of pigment to binder, whatever kind of binder you're using, because that is basically gonna be your starting point to judge like if your pigment needs more binder, if your pigment needs less. Some things to look out for that are really helpful right here. I'm mulling right here, and you guys can see in these areas, I haven't mulled very long, and you'll see in these areas right here how transparent it is. Those are areas where the pigment has not like been bound with the binder yet, not been incorporated yet. What I'm doing here when I'm mulling on this plate, I'm not breaking down the pigments. The pigments, if you like grind your own pigments, for one, you've got to be very careful about particle size. The better the pigments, the more consistent the particle size tends to be. And when you brine whatever pigment you're using onto your plate to mix around, you want to see, as I'm going, that pigment, like this color here, all these waves that you see, it'll start getting way more consistent. You'll start being able to tell a lot less where I've been moving this muller, because you'll be able to see less of these transparent lines that are coming through. Yes.
Speaking of the muller, does it have to be glass?
It doesn't. So I would recommend glass because it is the easiest for you to use. But you know, we've been making paints for centuries and centuries as humans, and prior to having glass, like people would use things like really smooth rocks, and they would grind them with that. That being said, that is very difficult and it takes a lot of energy. These kind of glass mullers, this is like the plate and the muller are both New York Central brand. They are gonna make your life a lot easier. This is a lot easier to hold than a rock. It's a lot easier to move around than a rock, and it has a much more consistent surface. This flat surface that it has is super important. You don't want any bumps or roundness, because that can like really make your life miserable when you're pushing this thing around for, you know, half an hour to an hour at a time. So it is not like you don't need it to be glass, but you really want it to be glass. So I'm gonna start moving this around. One thing you'll start to notice, I think I did a decent job right now, but you'll start to notice it more as I grind on if I didn't do a good job, is that if you have too much pigment, and I'm gonna try to we have a lot of iridescent right here that I'm gonna try to get in. If you have too much pigment and not enough binder, around your edges, you're gonna start to see dried clumps of pigment because you're essentially pushing that pigment out because your binder, you don't have enough binder for it to be able to incorporate everything. And I might have to add a little bit of binder here, but I'm just gonna keep mulling. We're gonna try to see if I can get rid of that streakiness that's happening and get it really incorporated. But I'm just gonna try to keep moving it around. And it doesn't take a whole lot of upper arm strength to do this. It's really more about the movement itself than the arm strength, because the heaviness of this glass muller and the texture of this plate is gonna do a lot of the mulling for you. But it is a matter of like moving this around and pushing it against like the tackiness of this paint. I almost feel here that it might be a little too thin and we might not have enough liquid being pushed around. Now I made a very small batch because we have limited time here, and I would like to show you guys how I pan this and how I clean the plate before the class ends. But we'll get moving here. And we have a few different sizes of this too. I could have shown this to you guys on a smaller plate. They do offer those, and we even have these little tiny molars. And I want to take it out because it's really, really cute. Look how tiny this is. It's so cute. So if you want to make really small batches of paint, like a small molar and a small grinding plate might be a little easier for you. It's probably going to be a little more affordable. And if you don't need all of the space, then you don't need it. It is helpful to have a large grinding plate because, as you see here, even this tiny amount of paint gets spread around really fast. But I'm going to keep trying to incorporate it here. And I mentioned this earlier. Okay, Industrial Revolution, which I know is really funny for me to say. I'm trying to bring history into this because I think it's neat. But as I was saying earlier, prior to the Industrial Revolution, they didn't really add humectants into their paints very much when they were making it themselves. They would essentially make dried cakes, kind of what you see in here, where I didn't add any humectant into this, of just binder and pigment. And you can use this and you can paint with this and it'll reactivate. It doesn't preserve as well and it's more difficult to reactivate than when you have paints with humectants in it. So like to the point where a lot of artists would create these and then essentially grind them up with water prior to painting. And there's actually, like, this is one form of paint making. There's actually several forms of paint making. And one of the other forms of paint making out there is a Japanese type of paint making where they essentially incorporate pigment and what is called I think it's nikawa. I don't know any Japanese, but it's Nikawa in the anglicized form. A nikawa binder, and they will mix them right before they use them and then paint with them right there, and then they wouldn't keep the paints that they mixed. Like, they would try to use the entirety of the paint they mixed. They would mix just a little tiny batch of this pigment with the binder and then paint directly with that. So that was one way they used pigments prior to, like, factories producing large amounts of them. And then, you know, in the West, we would essentially have these cakes that we would use and grind up or really work a ton of water into to be able to do our watercolor paints. But when the Industrial Revolution came around, people were like, oh, well, we want to be able to sell large tubes of paint. And I'm actually going to show you guys here. I have, let me see if I can find it, some tubes. We have these amazing tubes that you can put your own handmade paints into. And I actually used a bit of watercolor ground to make a little swatch here. It's not the most consistent swatch because the watercolor ground doesn't adhere the best to this. It took me a couple layers. But you can tube your paints when you're done if you make a large amount and then keep them in tubes. But the humectants are really very important if you want to do that. And the clove oil, because it's going to help keep your paint preserved and keep it wet. Some things to keep in mind if you're making your own paints is that lots of times brands, they will add in like stronger preservatives, synthetic preservatives, as well as things that will make your paints more light fast and more durable. So sometimes when you make your own paints, it's a little more difficult to get things that are as permanent and light fast and easy to preserve as you do when you get them store-bought. So keep that in mind when you're creating your own paints. You don't necessarily want them sitting around for a super long time. That's why I recommend that you try to pan them if you can. And these are also, we got a lot of New York Central stuff. These are the New York Central whole pans that we're using there. So, you guys can kind of see it. I used the spatula right here to kind of scoop everything into the middle. You can see how liquidy that still is. It looks very thin on my plate right now. And again, we're only making a tiny amount. You saw all the binder I used and everything to make this only tiny amount of paint. But it's starting to get incorporated where you see less of that streakiness that you saw when I first started. And you're going to want to keep doing this, essentially bringing your paint back into the center and then mulling it out again so it doesn't get too out of control. Okay. I'm going to use one of my palette knives here to kind of get that little bit off. Incorporate it back in. And then I'm going to keep mulling and we'll see. I can also too, here I'll use this. Your paint is going to accumulate a lot on this muller, especially around the edges here. So you're going to want to make sure when you're doing this that you kind of take your spatula to this as well and make sure you get the edges. and then tap it in. And at this point, we can even do a little swatch. I didn't get brushes or any water. I just realized that. There was a lot of stuff I had to bring out onto the table tonight, but while Emmy is graciously getting me something, I'll show you guys this real quick. This is a little kind of experiment that I did where I showed you the differences. I tried to show you the differences between honey and glycerin when it comes to your humectants that you want to use. This is actually gouache, the Turner Design gouache that I put in here. And the reason I used like pre-made gouache for this instead of watercolors is that gouache is kind of known for like not panning particularly well if you want to stick it in a pan. And actually, I'm going to take my mask off real quick because the pigment is incorporated enough where it's not going to be floating in the air. So I'll be able to talk. But I have poured a little bit of gouache into each of these because the best thing that your humectant does is that it can help your paints keep from cracking and keep them just a little bit more damp. But I'll show you here. This right here was my control. So this is, I'm going to hold this up so you guys can see it a little bit better. This was just straight gouache right here. This one right here was where I added a lot of glycerin. You can see how shiny that is. In fact, it's still wet. I don't want to touch it, but this paint is still wet here. That's what happens when you add way too much humectant into your paint, is that it will not cure. And it's super, super glossy. And if I paint it down on a piece of paper, it will dry on the piece of paper, but it's more likely to stay sticky if I do. This one right here, you can see it also cracked because I added the tiniest little bit of glycerin, and really I should have added more. Because if I get closer to, this is our honey right here, and this, I added what I considered a lot of honey in. I didn't really measure this out. I was just tried to get the same amount of glycerin as I did honey for each of these. So I added like a good amount of honey in, and you can see it's a little more matte than a lot of glycerin. It's also still wet like the glycerin, but you can see a little bit, I'm trying to get you guys a good view of this, that it didn't really crack as much as any of these did. I mean, this didn't really crack either, but it's also super wet still. And then our last one here was just the tiniest bit of honey. So these two, what I could have done is added a little bit more of honey and a little bit more of glycerin, and they would have panned a lot better. So if you have watercolors or gouache or something that you want to experiment a little bit with, you can try putting in a little bit of clove oil, a little bit of, I mean not clove oil because that's a preservative and your paint should already have that if you're getting store-bought, a little bit of honey or a little bit of vegetable glycerin. You can incorporate those in and you can see if it will kind of change the quality of your paints so they're more like what you want them to be. But, see here, I got our papers here, yes.
Speaking of humectants, which one re-wets better, honey or glycerin?
Actually, I just remembered something I was going to do now that Emmy kindly brought me over a brush and some water. We are going to, I'm going to swatch these so you guys can kind of see the difference is between them. So I'm going to push this, give me 1 second, very carefully so you guys can see that. We're going to get back to that in just a second. And I'm going to wet each of these and do a little swatch. So this is our straight gouache right here. And gouache is made out of a lot of the same components as watercolors, which is why it works well here. The main difference is that gouache tends to have another extra thing in it that makes it opaque. So some pigments like trans oxides, you can kind of create a gouache out of them without adding extra things in, but lots of times people will add things like chalk, or I think something called byrate into them to make them a little more opaque. But this is our gouache right here. I'm gonna add a little bit of water because it's gouache, so it's not going to reactivate quite as easily as watercolors. So we're getting it going there. We're going to swatch out a little bit. It's our typical gouache. Something to keep in mind though, if you're adding anything into your store-bought paints, or even your paints that you make yourselves, anything you add is going to change the quality. And particularly for gouache, it can affect the opacity if you add in a little bit of a humectant. So keep that in mind. So this is the one that had a lot of glycerin to it, and you can see it's still wet, so of course it re-wets super easily, and it is sticky. So I'm gonna lay that down there and you can see just how sticky that is. And I'll hold this up in a second so you guys can see it a little better. So that was our heavy glycerin. We're gonna do our light glycerin, which I suspect, since I didn't quite add enough glycerin to get this to stop cracking, that it's gonna perform pretty similarly to our gouache, but we'll see if it re-wets a little bit easier. And I think it's about the same. Maybe a little bit better. But that's like our tiny bit of glycerin that I probably should have added a little bit more to. You can see it's pretty similar to the gouache, the straight gouache. Okay, now we're gonna get into our honey. Lots and lots of honey in this one. You see that one also re-wets super easily. It's a little bit drier than our glycerin is. Both glycerin and honey are very powerful, but it is a little bit more matte than the glycerin ended up being. So I'm gonna swatch that real quick. And you can see it's kind of similar to the excessive amounts of glycerin in terms of what their swatches looks like. And give me just 1 second because I'll let you guys see this a little bit better. Gonna get a little more water, make sure my brush is clean. Yes.
Question about the honey. Will that make the paint more attractive to bugs?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. So I actually do a lot of plein air painting, and I don't think I work with honey specific paints, but I don't think I've ever had that problem with my honey based paints. I think as long as there's going to be preservatives in your paints, there's going to be things that keep it from rotting. And honey, believe it or not, none of these smell like honey. I mean, you saw, I put a lot more honey in than I did clove oil. Clove oil is the thing you smell. Clove oil is the only thing we smell right now. So I don't think it will. If you have paint that's really sticky like this, because there's an excessive amount of honey in it, it might. But I'm not entirely sure about that. Okay, so we have our swatches here. You guys can see a little bit of the difference. Whoop, going the wrong way. Okay, you can see how in the one that's glycerin heavy, there's a bit of a sheen on it. Yeah. Especially right there. There's a bit of a sheen on it where it was a little thicker. And the same is true for honey. I know the camera's kind of mattifying it, so you can't quite see it as well. But these three, they're about the same because I didn't quite add enough glycerin and I didn't quite add enough honey for these really small amounts. But these ones, you can see just how sticky it ended up being. And they work pretty similarly. People have their favorites, whether they want to use glycerin or honey. Like I said, I think a lot of people prefer glycerin because I've heard that it's easier to work with. Again, unfortunately, I'm not a master paint maker, so I couldn't say specifically. I've done both of these. This one was with clove oil, and this one was with honey. And you can see they both have too much in it. So they both basically have the same effect where they're too shiny and too tacky. That's kind of the best I can give you. I think a lot of it comes down to preference. A lot of people, when they make their own paint, I think it's so like, they feel closer to the art materials, but a lot of people also like to use all natural pigments when they're working with them. And I think it helps some people like connect with nature, feel closer to the earth. And so a lot of people like to use honey because it's from nature. It feels a lot more natural than the glycerin. And lots of people too will use honey that's local to the area, so it almost has like more of a connection to them. So I think that's one of the bigger differences when it comes to them. But yeah, humectants are very important when it comes to watercolors, and they can make a really big difference. And I just remembered that I was gonna swatch this, so we're gonna do that really fast. Like I said, there's a lot to cover when it comes to making your own watercolor paints. We'll see, I'm just gonna grab a little bit. It's kind of sticky. So hopefully, I said at the beginning that I thought I might have added too much honey in, so I might have. But you guys can see there, it's a little bit shiny. I'm sad that you guys can't see the shine quite as well as I can, because I promise you it's there, and maybe you can see it better in our paint that's down here, how like shiny it is. But it looks decently good, you know, I'm not getting a lot of splotchiness. There's a little bit of splotchiness in here. But that's essentially what you want to look for, is clean, consistent color, and you want it to deposit pigment like evenly. So if you get a lot of super blotchiness when you're painting, that's how you know it's not depositing evenly. And whenever you make your own paints, I can see if we can get a little bit better view in the side view. Whenever you make your own paints, you're gonna notice that they're almost gonna look a little granular It's not granulation, because granulation is something very specific to pigments. It's not something that you can really create when you're making a paint. But whenever, like, at least when I have made my own paints, there's a little bit of like, okay, let me see if I can get it even closer here. We're looking at really tiny details in this one. There's a little bit of like spottiness to it. And see, the longer I grind this for, the more consistent of a color we're going to get. So I'm gonna keep grinding here. We got about 20 minutes, so I think I can do at least like another 10 minutes of mulling. And you can see too, it's getting a little sticky and a little tacky. I'll make sure I get the paint off of my spatula here. So I might go in and dab just the tiniest bit of distilled water into this. Something to be aware of. Like I said earlier, lots of people will create their own gum arabic syrups using distilled water. But if you add too much distilled water in during this point in the process, your paints, well, one, they're gonna get very watery, and they're gonna be more likely to crack when you pan them. The higher water content you have in your paints, the more likely they're gonna be able to crack, because while water is evaporating out of it, it's kind of like, it's taking a lot out of your paint if you have a high water content, and so you're more likely to see little cracks and everything. I don't know if I explained that particularly well. But hopefully you guys can see, let me know if you can, that there's a lot more consistency in this. It's not as like streaky as it originally was, but it also looks like there's a lot less paint than there originally was. Like you can see how far out we were getting it because we're incorporating that pigment more into that binder, so the binder is essentially becoming less liquidy. It's getting that pigment like deep into the crevices of the binder. Which is a really kind of funny way to put it. But that's essentially what it's doing. It's gripping onto those pigments, and we're just trying to disperse it evenly within the binder, so it's gonna get a little thicker and a little tackier the longer you work, not just because your water's evaporating, but because you're incorporating it into the binder. Yes.
Pat is wondering if there's like a general rule for how much gum arabic it would take to make a full pan.
Okay, that really depends. So I have been doing either half a tablespoon or a tablespoon for each of these. I actually wrote my ratios on the sides of these. You can kind of see here, I did 1/4 the amount of pigment to 1 teaspoon of binder in this one. I generally used a teaspoon for each of these, and I got almost a full whole pan. Some of them came out a little bit shorter. So I put 1 part pigment to 2 parts gum arabic, but it was probably more like I used 1 tablespoon of gum arabic and half a tablespoon of pigment for this one. And you can see like there's not a whole lot of paint in this. Some pigments will kind of make the gum arabic a bit thicker than other pigments, and that will make it like a little bit less paint. Like you can see this blue paint, I got a really thin pan of it here, and we have very little paint right here, and I'm actually gonna take this and kind of scoop it into the middle. You can get, like, I am keeping my ratios not very drastic, but there are some pigments out there, the ones that tend to be more difficult to work with, that you will have to use like 1/10 of the amount of pigment per, like, for like a full part of binder. A really small amount of pigment for how much binder you will need. I actually think I probably need to add a little bit of distilled water to it. You can kind of see how tacky it's getting. It's getting a little sticky. And you can see how much it's going out here. Again, I made a small amount so we would be able to do this, but I'm gonna take a little dropper. I got these little droppers here. And I'm gonna just reach into my jug of distilled water really quick. And I'm gonna use the tiniest amount of this, because like I said, you don't want this to get too liquidy, otherwise it's gonna lead to a lot of cracking. So just a few drops. I'm gonna put the rest of that back into my jug here. And then I'm gonna just take my muller. And it gets slippery when you do this. It gets very slippery, and you can kind of see there's spots where I put the distilled water down. I'm gonna try to get rid of those spots so that I know it's fully incorporated into the pigment. And it's a lot easier to mull around. And I kind of know that I've added too much pigment here and not enough binder, because I'm getting those chunky kind of spots of pigment around the edges like I warned you guys about. So I could even go back and add more binder in, but for the sake of time here, since that would take me a really long time to reincorporate into this, I'm going to pan this, and I'm gonna show you guys how you can clean this off, because paint making, it's messy. You're gonna make a mess, and that's okay. And you can wear gloves when you're doing this as well. This is a non-toxic pigment. It's okay if I get it on my hands. It's no different than if I got just the straight watercolor on my hands. But you can use gloves with this, especially if you're prone to messes. So I'm gonna take my spatula here. I'm gonna try to do my best to pull this paint into the center. You can see this is a tiny amount of paint. We've really shrunken it down here. And I'm gonna show you guys how you can tube paint. But we're not going to do it with this because it just doesn't make sense to tube this small amount of paint. I'm going to scoop a little bit of that off. But we're going to pan it, and then we're going to do a little swatch just so we can see if it turned out all right. See all that tiny amount of paint? I'm going to use my palette knife here. I'm sorry if you don't like the scraping. I know it's scraping on glass isn't exactly the most pleasant sound. But we're kind of getting this tiny little bit of iridescent paint here. Like I said too, I incorporated mica powder into this, which probably helped a lot with the shrinkage of how little paint I ended up getting. Like you guys saw, like I had a little puddle of binder here that ended up shrinking down in this tiny amount of paint. But I'm going to get a pan, some of our whole pans here. And I'm gonna scoop this up into it. And all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my palette knife here. And your paint should be thick enough where it's not going to immediately drip right off of your palette knife. Mine might be a little too thick, so I might need to get another palette knife to kind of push it along. But if you pick your paint up and it's dripping, you have probably too high of a liquid content. It should at least kind of, like, there should be a high amount of I guess water tension is what I'm looking for. Surface tension, that's it. Surface tension. Where it shouldn't be, if it's absolutely dripping off, then it's a little too much. And I'm gonna take my other palette knife here. I'm just gonna scoop that right into this. Look how little paint that is. It's kind of sad. So guys can kind of see, like, we're very lucky to have tubes of pre-made paint that we can access very easily. Because the amount of effort that this took for this tiny amount of paint, you can imagine how difficult it would have been to become an artist prior to the Industrial Revolution, where you would have to do all of this kind of work to get this tiny amount of paint, and then have to work with just that. Not to mention all of the materials that you would have to be able to find that weren't as accessible back then. But I'm going to take my palette knife and I'm going to kind of swish this around in here. Try to even it out. We want to make sure there's no air bubbles, just like when you're typically panning. I could go back here, since there's such a small amount, and I could make more of this, and I could add another layer to this pan. But I'm going to try to smooth around on the bottom of this the best I can, make sure there's no air bubbles in it. You can use a toothpick for this, or any kind of thin thing. I'm just using my palette knife right here. And I'm going to give it a little tap. Help settle it down a bit, and I'll put it up here so you guys can try to see the iridescence. Yes.
Will the grind size of the pigment, I guess is how to phrase it, affect the final color of the paint?
So it won't affect the hue of your paint, but it will affect the consistency of your paint. So if you don't buy your pigments pre-done like we have here, if you're trying to mold them down yourselves, it's gonna be difficult because you want to try to get as consistent a pigment size as possible and as small of a pigment size as possible. It's gonna take a lot of grinding and a lot of work to be able to do that. And if you don't have a consistent pigment size, then you're gonna get really uneven textures with your paint. You're gonna get some areas that are really dark and some areas that even look clumpy. And if there's too much pigment incorporated into your paint, you'll even be able to rub your swatches of it and you'll see pigment flake off. So it does make a difference when it comes to texture, not so much when it comes to color. I'm gonna move this forward a little bit so we can do our little swatch here. The thing about pigments that makes them unique and special is that essentially a pigment can be almost any kind of material that can be ground down without losing its color. And that is insoluble in whatever material you're going to put it in. So in this case, we want it to be insoluble in water. So keeps its color when it's ground down, insoluble in water. Those are essentially the two things that make a pigment what it is, which is why we unfortunately can't just go outside and see like a flower that we really like and grind that flower down and get that color, because once that flower is ground down, the cells in it aren't able to hold on to the color that they were, and they will degrade. The hue of the color will degrade, and most of the time they turn brown, which is sad. That's why a lot of things like precious stones are used as pigments, because generally they're able to keep their color when they're ground down, and they won't be dissolved when you put them in something like a water. We can see here, I got a bit of a chunk of it there. But here's our swatch. I think it looks pretty good. Let me know what you think, if you think it turned out well. There's a little bit of a difference between this stage and this stage, and it's gonna be difficult for you guys to see on camera. This one just looks a little bit more granular. I'll try to get it as close as possible. Whoop. Yeah, let's go to our dynamic here and see if we can get it on that. Okay. This is our final swatch here. Here are our little two test swatches. They have a little bit more spotting in them. Let's call it spotting, where you can kind of see areas where the pigments chunked together. It's very difficult to see. This is one thing too that really makes a master paint maker, is that they're able to look at this and see what the difference is between these little minute details and make the paint the best they can. And you can see a little bit the iridescence if you compare it to our gouache up here that's super matte. You can see just how shiny it is, because these two are dry, but they're just a little bit shinier. And I could have gone in and put a little bit mica in to make it a little more iridescent, but like I said, mica tends to be very difficult to work with. I can show you our final pan here too, if I can. It's very pretty. Yeah, sparkly. I'm putting my finger in front of it. You can see how messy my fingers got too. They look just a little bit blue. Okay, we got that little pan here, and before we go tonight, I'm going to show you guys how you can clean this up safely. Because one thing we want to do when we're paint making, and really when we're doing any kind of painting, is that we don't want to wash this off in our sink at home and pour this all down the sink, especially if we're using a pigment that is toxic. We really do not want that in the water system. And even this, like, paint really adds up. It can clog your plumbing, and even pigments that aren't toxic to humans can be toxic to wildlife. So that's something to keep in mind when we're putting that back into our water system. So what we're going to do here, it's really simple. It's easier than it was for oil painting, since watercolor, all of the mediums that we use for it, except for the clove oil and the pigment, are water soluble. All you got to do is get a spray bottle like this lovely aqua mist here. This doesn't need to be distilled water, since we're cleaning it up. We're not going to use any of this paint. You can directly paint from this if you want to. Like, if you make paint and then you want to make a painting from your leftovers here, feel free to do it. But all we got to do is get it nice and damp. And then I'm going to get my rag. I'm just going to start wiping it off. And since this plate has a lot of really fine texture in it and it's been sanded down, this is going to take us a second to clean. And it might seem clean, even after like the first few swipes I do at this. It's gonna seem clean, but it won't be, I promise you. It's important to get your plates clean between different colors, because even the smallest bit of pigment can change the color that you're making. I'm gonna try to get my palette knives clear here. They've got little chunks of pigment on the back, so there we go. But it's gonna take a lot of different passes of wetting this down and washing it to be able to get the pigment out of all of the little grooves and everything in this, so we can make sure we're not transferring any color into our other pieces. But I'm gonna keep scrubbing at this. I'm just using water. I would just throw this rag away afterwards. It's always ideal if you can to try and dispose of things like this in a landfill where they have a toxic waste facility. That's what they're called, right? Toxic waste facilities. any kind of facility that will take your potentially toxic or hazardous materials, hazardous waste facility, that's it, and dispose of them in a way that's safe for our environment. So I'm gonna get this wet so I can take this off. So if you can do that, like, please do. If you don't have access to one, it's a lot better if your paint ends up dry on a rag in the landfill rather than going straight into our water system. I know that's not the most helpful, but it is better if you had to make a choice. So I'm just gonna keep wiping this down. The muller really gets thick areas of paint accumulated on the side. This is a nice spray bottle too. I personally endorse this spray bottle, but it sprays really fine for like a long time. I know that's kind of funny to be like particular about a spray bottle, but I love this one. Yeah, they're all nodding back there. They're going, yes, it is nice.
You just don't understand until you use it.
Yeah, yeah. It's like you don't think you're missing out in the world of spray bottles until you use a really nice one, and then you're like, no, I see what you mean. Okay, so I got my muller wiped off pretty well there. The muller luckily does not have the same, I mean, not really luckily, but it doesn't have the same texture as our plate here, so it's a lot easier to clean off. Gonna get into these little grooves here, but you can see it's starting to look pretty clean. There's a lot of blue still on here. I'm gonna go back through this with another pass of water, and I'm gonna make sure I get my tools off here. Stuff like this is covered in gum arabic. Gum arabic, it's water soluble, it's also non-toxic. So I can also just wipe this off with a bit of water. It's important to note too, this is kind of a funny thing to have to say, but sometimes I hear people, particularly people my age, say this. So I want to make it clear that whenever I say something is non-toxic, that does not mean it's edible. Do not eat any of your art supplies. When people label things as non-toxic, they're saying that it is non-toxic when it is used correctly for its intended purposes. So do not eat these, but it will not harm you when it is used for its correct purposes. That does not mean you want to be consuming it. Okay, so I got my, also if you use things like measuring spoons for these kinds of materials, please don't then go use them for food. Same thing, even if you think they're really clean, we really don't want you getting that kind of cross-contamination between your art supplies and your food. That's a dangerous game that you do not want to be playing. So, I sprayed this with a little more water. I'm gonna get my little spatcher here too. These things are so helpful. I could have used the palette knife when I was doing it, but these kind of rubber spatchers, like this one from Creative Mark, are really helpful. They get the paint going a lot better than the palette knife does. The palette knife, especially since this has like texture to it, will kind of just scrape the surface and it won't get all of the paint back into the center. So if you do have something rubber like this, definitely use it. It will be a lot less frustrating than your palette knife, because I was using a palette knife when I first started making these paints and it was frustrating. So I'm just gonna wipe this tiny bit of pigment that was in my little tablespoon off here. Actually, this is a 1/8 teaspoon. So I'm going to put that to the side. Something helpful like I did here with my pans, once you have your pan made and it's dried a little bit, take something like a water resistant Sharpie or anything like that that isn't going to like wipe off with water, and you can mark the ratios that you used, the pigment that you used, and other things so you don't lose what you did to create that paint. And I just remembered too, coming back to panning your paint and how your environment can affect that. Humidity can affect how you pan your paints. It can essentially just makes them a lot longer to dry, a lot longer to be fully usable between when you put them in the pan and when they're done. And humidity at times, well, both high heat and high humidity can lead your paints to crack easier. It's something to consider. You don't need an environment controlled room to be able to make paints. But if you're getting really frustrated, like your paints are all still really tacky and you live in a super humid environment, that might be a factor to consider. So this looks decently clean, right? We can still see, honestly, it's a lot easier to see on camera what parts are dirty than it is in person here. But it looks decently good. But I'll show you guys something really helpful we have here. Are the Soho Studio wipes. Emmy used these. These work when you're making oil paints because they will pick up oil-based things really well. But you can also use them when you're making watercolors. This is actually my last wipe because we go through these really fast here. But they're super helpful. But you can see, I can also use this to wipe off my surface. You can see this, it's blue. It's turning blue. It's gonna take a lot of layers of me for me to clean this. But do you guys have any last questions? Because we are about to wrap up here. It was a lot of info. I will be going through early tomorrow morning and answering any questions that weren't answered. So don't be afraid if you have a really dying question and it didn't get answered. I will make sure I come back through that chat and we'll get your problem sorted out. I'm gonna wipe this off. I'm gonna go back through with my rag one more time. So, if you guys saw any of the materials tonight in this live show and you wanted to check them out for yourselves, make sure you go to jerrysartorama.com and type into that search bar our class code for tonight, which was JL294. If you make your own paints, if you're exploring paint making, if you use any of them for painting, please post it in our Jerry's Live Facebook group. But make sure if you try to join that you answer the security question. Otherwise, we will deem you a robot and we will not let you in, which would be sad. But next week's show, Andrew Cook. We have a lovely vendor show coming up with Andrew Cook, and I'm really excited to have you guys here. It is Facebook only. I may have forgotten to write this part down. It is a Facebook only show, so if you come to us here on YouTube, you will be able to watch it after the show has ended. It will be posted to YouTube, but if you want to watch it live, make sure you go over to Facebook to check it out. It's going to be a great time. I believe Emmy's going to be hosting it. So, thank you guys so much. One last question?
Just a point on YouTube. We won't be on YouTube Live for 3 weeks.
Oh,
it's a Zoom.
Yes.
It's July 4th, and then another Zoom.
As she said, Zoom next week. It's going to be July 4th. We are not going to have a show on July 4th. We figured you guys would probably be out celebrating. We will be. And then the week after that is another Zoom show. So for the next 3 weeks, I am sorry, our YouTube fans, but you're not going to be able to find us here. The shows will be posted to YouTube after they have been live, though. So check us out on Facebook. Thank you guys so much for coming tonight. It has been a great show. And yeah, bye.